Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to call our sessions to order. My name is Bob Rawson. It's my privilege and honor to serve as the interim dean of the School of Law of Case Western Reserve University, and in that capacity to welcome everybody here. I especially want to welcome our distinguished speakers who, as you know, if you reviewed the materials and as you meet them, you'll see, come not only from our case family, but also from institutions, renowned institutions around the country. They also come from different disciplines, and I think that's what's a fascinating feature of what we're about to be treated to during the course of the symposium today. I had the pleasure of having dinner with the speakers last evening, and I think you'll find as you meet them that they are intriguing people with a lot of value to say, all value to tell you, and as I say, they reflect different approaches to our subject, forgiveness, reconciliation, and the law. And I think for those of us who come at this from the law perspective, it is extraordinarily helpful to get the perspectives of other disciplines as we think about how those disciplines can help us as we think about the impact and relevance of forgiveness and reconciliation in what we do as lawyers, either in the academy or in the practice of law. Now, just a word about the Center for Interdisciplinary Study of Conflict and Dispute Resolution, which is a mouthful, not only in saying it, but also in what it embodies in what its aspirations are. We call it SISTER for short, just because it makes conversation a lot easier, so I'll refer to it that way. And SISTER is one of our newest centers of excellence. It's only been around for 4 years, but you wouldn't know that if you look at all that's been accomplished. As many of you would know, SISTER has been responsible for a series of extraordinary lectures during that period of time, but this is the first all-day symposium that SISTER has sponsored. So we're delighted to have you with us and join with us as we explore the subjects today. But the person who has been responsible for leading SISTER from its inception to today is Professor Calvin Sharpe. Professor Sharpe, whom many of you would know because Calvin is everywhere within the disciplines, has done an extraordinary job setting up this center. But in addition to that, he is the John Deaver Drinko Baker and Hostetler Professor of Law here at the law school, a very esteemed and valued colleague, very active both in terms of his scholarship but also in terms of his citizenship within the School of Law. So it gives me great pleasure to now turn the proceedings over to Professor Calvin Sharpe, who will introduce both the subject and those who will be speaking about it. Calvin.
Thank you, Dean Rawson, for those wonderful welcoming remarks and those kind words. And thank you also for your institutional and moral support of this important event in the intellectual life of the law school. SISTER's guiding principle is to deepen our understanding of conflict and how to most effectively respond to it from interdisciplinary perspectives and a focus on theory and practice. To this end, among other things, the Center, as the Dean mentioned, sponsors 3 distinguished lectures annually, one focusing on legal theory, one focusing on practice, and a third featuring an interdisciplinary scholar. The brochure will give you an idea of the caliber of lectures that the Center has sponsored thus far. What they have in common is original and high-level work. Today's symposium participants share these attributes. Their distinguished biographies are in the program material, so I won't repeat them here. What I will do is to introduce them with a brief excerpt from their work that gives you a sense about their thinking. So what I will do at this point is to ask the 3 morning participants to take your positions on the bench before these what I'll call substantive introductions, and then we will do the same thing this afternoon. What I want to do before I get into the substance here is to introduce Kathy Hesser. Her biography is also in the materials, which you can read, but I wanted you to know that Kathy is a very special person in the life of Sister because she was there at the inception as its associate director. She and I were in collaboration before Sister was conceived about how we might bring a quality ADR program to the law school that would have a theoretical and also a practical component that operated through the clinic. Kathy had been a clinical professor. So Kathy and I started thinking about and working on this symposium a couple of years ago. Unfortunately for us, but quite fortunately for her, the law school lost Kathy this past year to Lewis and Clark, where she's become the director of their animal rights clinic, pursuing her passion in the field of animal rights. So I'm particularly delighted that Kathy was able to return to participate in the symposium, and as I mentioned, she will moderate the afternoon panel. Thank you very much, Kathy. So, as I mentioned, I will introduce each of the panelists and the luncheon keynote speaker through excerpts of their work, starting with Charles Griswold. In a discussion between himself and Father William Menninger about forgiveness and apology, Charles said, "I disagree with the idea of unconditional forgiveness. To my mind, that view collapses forgiveness into either excuse or condemnation, precisely because it demands nothing of the offender, while neither of the two texts espousing unconditional forgiveness deploy the metaphor of gift-giving to characterize the unilateral forgiveness bestowed by the victim on the offender, given that the metaphor seems so natural a way to express the unilateral waiving of the debt, as well as the one-sided way in which the wrongdoer is released from the victim's vengeful anger. It is worth noting that the metaphor does not perfectly cohere with the view that forgiveness is unilateral, for gifts, too, come with expectations of reciprocity attached."
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I thought that what I would do would be to summarize some of the basic theses and distinctions about the topic. These are drawn primarily from my book on forgiveness. The topic of forgiveness is, as you know, surprisingly complicated, with multiple connections to seemingly disparate areas, such as ethics, moral psychology, the theory of the emotions, metaethics, political theory, and so forth. There is a handout in your brochure, in your packet there, which I hope will help you to follow along. In my book, I attempted to answer these questions, and will attempt to summarize them concisely here. What is forgiveness? When is it appropriate? And why is it commendable? So I start with the observation that forgiveness is a concept that comes with correctness conditions. It's governed by norms, which is to say that you have not forgiven simply because you declare that you have. You could be mistaken in whole or in part. This, of course, is not unique to forgiveness. It's also the case with respect to, say, justice. You could have a view about justice, and the mere fact that you hold it doesn't make it the correct view, and the fact that you declare yourself to have acted justly or not doesn't mean that you have. And the same thing, I submit, is true with respect to forgiveness. As Calvin just mentioned, forgiveness must, on my view, be distinguished from excuse, condemnation, and forgetting. And a theory which does not sustain these distinctions fails. And holding that I am not by any means unique. I think most theorists of the subject would agree. Now, a central difference with excuse, with which it's often confused, centers on the role of responsibility. There are also conditions for excusing, but an assumption is always that the excused was in some sense or to some degree responsible for the wrong done. A central difference with condemnation, forgiveness cannot be commendable if it collaborates with ignoring or furthering the wrong in question, which would be condemnation, for then it would not be a virtue. Now, it may be true that one can forgive and then forget, although actually I would dispute that, but it's certainly not true that one could forget and therefore forgive. As the difference with forgetting shows, not all ways of overcoming moral anger count as forgiveness. And forgiveness is not the magic bullet that washes away, if a bullet can wash anything away, moral hatred and resentment. There is a tendency to think of forgiveness as a sort of panacea, and the view that I'm advancing pushes against that. My central focus is forgiveness understood as a moral relation between two individuals, one of whom has wronged the other, and who, at least in what I call the ideal or the paradigmatic case, are capable of communicating with each other. The victim's response to suffering a wrong is properly a certain form of resentment or anger or hatred, which may be warranted and indeed praiseworthy. So in saying this, I'm siding with Aristotle and Bishop Butler and many others, and arguing that a virtuous person will feel anger at the right time, in the right way, to the right degree. And I'm arguing against the Stoics, who claimed that the good person eliminates anger from his or her life. Now, there's a lot to be said about what anger is. Anger is a very complicated emotion. The kind of anger that I'm thinking of here is not anger in response to natural evil or natural bad, not the kind of anger that you experience, presumably, when you stub your toe against the hard asphalt and curse the asphalt, but rather the kind of anger you feel in response to moral evil or wrong. That is to say, it is, to borrow the words of a philosopher by the name of Strawson, a reactive sentiment that reacts to or comes about in response to an intentional wrongdoing. So it's responsive in part to reasons, and this is also crucial to the kind of argument that I'm making. So anger is an emotion, but it's reasons responsive to. And this then raises the question, what would constitute good reasons for giving up warranted anger, since I'm postulating that there is such a thing as warranted anger? I'll return to that in a moment. I'll also return to my thought about paradigmatic or model forgiveness as distinguished from non-paradigmatic cases. A basic contention that I'd like to put forward is that forgiveness, if forgiveness is to come off fully, both parties to the transaction must take certain steps. And the warrant for doing so ultimately comes from moral ideals. The reciprocal character of forgiveness may distinguish it among the virtues, though possibly something like Aristotelian friendship may have a similar structure. That is to say, for other virtues, it seems at first glance that a reciprocal structure is not in place. For example, you could be just without the person who is, so to speak, the target of your justice doing anything other than creating conditions which require you to be just. Forgiveness is not like that on my account, as you'll see further in a second. The dependence of virtue on moral ideals, the dependence I just mentioned, is certainly not a new point, and it is very important for my account. For these ideals help us to understand what dispositions of character will get picked out as counting as virtues. I'll return to that also. So I've been talking about forgiveness, or to be precise, forgivingness, as a virtue of character. I'm thinking of forgiveness as the expression of forgivingness, which by definition happens at the right time, in the right way, and for the right reasons. To speak of forgiveness as a virtue is to connect it to agency and rationality, such that it wouldn't make any sense, for example, to talk about forgiveness as happening in an entirely unconscious way. Whatever is happening there can't be forgiveness, even if it does lead to the end of anger. And this view that I'm proposing seems entirely within the compass of quite ordinary notions of the subject. It is also consistent with our proclivity to praise the forgiving person and to see forgivingness as a trait of character. It also, that is to say, to see forgiveness as a virtue. I'll speak of just forgiveness rather than forgivingness, since it's more normal way of talking about the subject. It also illuminates its deontic character, because forgiveness is the right thing to do under the right circumstances, but not something that you must do, in the sense that it's not something that anyone has a right to force you to do. And that kind of structure is found in other virtues too, such as gratitude. So we would blame you for not being grateful under the right conditions, but we wouldn't claim that you must be in the sense that I just mentioned. Now, the model case of forgiveness should be distinguished from 5 non-paradigmatic cases that lack one or more of its features. And I take these to be modulations of the model case. In each non-paradigmatic case, special problems arise due to the absence of one of the features of forgiveness. These non-paradigmatic cases are lacking or imperfect relative to the paradigm, in the sense that were it possible for all of the conditions pertaining to the paradigm to be fulfilled, we would wish for them to be so. And the 5 that I distinguished, which are on your handout, are, under number 5, are forgiving wrongs done to others, commonly referred to as third-party forgiveness, forgiving the dead and the unrepentant, self-forgiveness, God's forgiveness, and perhaps even forgiving God. Now, the last 2 are not my concern in the book, as the context of my analysis is entirely secular. I do acknowledge that there is a fascinating set of issues to be explored about the relationship between secular and religious views, and indeed between different religious views, and in fact, not just that, but also within religious views. I strongly suspect, although I'm not a scholar of the subject, that the Christian view, for example, actually has a very interesting history, and that what we think of as Christian forgiveness today may actually be a quite recent development in the history of Christian thought of the subject. There are also pagan views which are not atheistic or irreligious, but are not exactly religious in the normal sense in which we think about them. And there's, I think, an extremely interesting investigation to be had about the role of forgiveness in, say, ancient Greece and Rome. And these kinds of investigations would, I think, shed interesting light on the conceptual conditions under which forgiveness has the sort of characteristics that I'm proposing, and the conditions under which forgiveness can be counted as a virtue. So, to return to this schema of paradigmatic and non-paradigmatic kinds of forgiveness, my way of sorting out this issue pays homage to our normal distinction between perfected and problematic instances of forgiveness, the latter being those in which, as I said, certain criteria that we would wish to be fulfilled haven't been. When you forgive on behalf of someone else, for example, you're doing something which may still count as forgiveness, but is inferior to the wrong party doing the forgiving. If you had a choice between the two, you would prefer that the wrong party do the forgiving. And this implies that there are certain basic conditions which every and any instance of forgiveness must meet. Let's call them threshold conditions. What are those? The threshold conditions of forgiveness, which even an imperfect or non-paradigmatic sort of case must meet, are, I think, threefold. First, the willingness of the victim to try to lower her pitch of resentment, as well as her ability to do so to some minimal degree and to forswear revenge. This, of course, assumes that the victim does feel resentment for the injury done. If not even that is felt, then, of course, this condition doesn't come into play. Secondly, the willingness, whether in fact or as imaginatively reconstructed by the victim, of the offender to take minimal steps to qualify for forgiveness. Picture here the victim being presented with the offender's deathbed letter of contrition that supplies a basis for reframing her view of the offender. And third, that the injury be humanly forgivable. This third issue, of course, touches on the famous problem of the unforgivable and whether there is such a thing. My own view, for what it's worth, is that if the unforgivable is understood conditionally, unforgivable until the offender does take certain steps, then there may be such a thing as the unforgivable. But if by the unforgivable you mean the unconditionally unforgivable, no matter what the offender does, I don't think that idea actually holds up to scrutiny, although it may be the case that certain evils are, for the moment, unforgiven. In any case, forgiveness won't come off at all, on my view, unless certain threshold conditions are met, namely the three that I've mentioned. And I think this idea of threshold conditions is consistent with a common assumption that not just anything can count as forgiveness. For example, if the victim doesn't forswear revenge, then surely forgiveness hasn't taken place. So that's a threshold condition. And between the satisfaction of those threshold conditions and satisfaction of all of the desired conditions lies a spectrum of cases presenting various levels of difficulty, conceptual and existential. Now, what would it mean to achieve perfected forgiveness or to achieve the model case? Here, as you will now expect, there are conditions on both sides of the equation, the offender and the victim, since, as I said, forgiveness to come off fully, if forgiveness is to come off fully, both parties have to meet these conditions because it has this bilateral logic that I mentioned. As to the offender, it seems to me that there are 6 conditions which ideally the offender meets. First, acknowledge that he or she was the responsible agent. Secondly, repudiate one's deeds by acknowledging their wrongness and oneself as their author. Third, express regret to the injured at having caused this particular injury. Fourth, commit to becoming the sort of person who does not inflict injury, a commitment to be shown through deeds as well as words. Fifth, show that one understands from the injured person's perspective the damage done by the injury, and this would require something like sympathy in this sense analyzed by Adam Smith. Sixth, offer a narrative accounting for how one came to do wrong, how that wrongdoing does not express the totality of one's person, and how one is becoming worthy of approbation. What must the injured party do if forgiveness is to come off? Well, first and most obviously, as I've already mentioned, forswear revenge. But secondly, moderate resentment. And third, commit to letting go of any lingering resentment. Fourth, the victim should, if forgiveness is to come off perfectly, re-envision the wrongdoer, and this is referred to in the literature often as reframing. And fifth, reframe one's view of oneself so as not to see oneself just as the victim or to identify oneself primarily as victim. And finally, address the offender and express forgiveness. It seems to me that satisfaction of these conditions ensures that forgiveness will not collapse into excuse or condemnation or something like forgetting, which, as you recall from the outset, is essential for any theory of the subject. This bilateral list of conditions also makes clear that, that the original social context that occasioned the need for forgiveness, namely one person injuring another, is inherited by the effort to repair that rupture. Forgiveness, so understood, rests on and expresses a number of moral ideals, namely those of respect, accountability, responsibility, trust, growth and renewal, peace and reconciliation. Without those ideals in the background, it would be hard to say why forgiveness is a virtue and why forgiveness is governed by just these conditions. A full theory of the subject would need to explain how these ideals underwrite the conditions I've spelled out, and also how forgiveness is a virtue is nested in a moral theory, because different kinds of moral theories, utilitarian or deontological and so forth, could admit of virtues. In fact, they do admit of virtues. But the moral theories, the overarching moral theories, are very different. So those two areas are very much needing to be further discussed. Now, forgiveness should also be distinguished from 5 related notions. These bear a Wittgensteinian family resemblance to one another. These are political apology, that is, apology offered in a political context; economic forgiveness, as when one forgives a debt; political pardon, as in a U.S. president's executive pardon; a judicial pardon, something like clemency or mercy offered by a judge; and what I've called metaphysical forgiveness, which is a category I more or less made up to include such things as forgiving the world for being the sort of place that it is. Now, these 5 are not imperfect versions of forgiveness. They're simply members of the same family, sharing some traits but not others, and which ones depends on the case. And if this approach is right, then we begin to see why political forgiveness is a bit of a misnomer. Indeed, as I've argued, It's a kind of miscategorization that rests on serious confusions. The political version of the transaction frequently takes place not between the individuals concerned, but between groups or between groups and individuals, and thus very much by representation and substitution. That is deeply different from the interpersonal context of forgiveness with which I began. In this political context, for example, it's often the case that representative of group X apologized to representative of group Y when neither of the representatives was personally party to the original wrongdoing. So that's very different from the interpersonal context. Like forgiveness, political apology, to focus on the first of these related notions, is a norm-governed concept. It too ought not to collapse into condemnation, excusing, or forgetting. The conditions for political apology partially overlap with those of interpersonal forgiveness. Versions of the first four, but not the fifth or sixth, steps required of the offender for forgiveness are not required in the context of political apology. Moreover, in accepting an apology in this context, political context, the victim forswears revenge, re-envisions the offender as well as self, but need not give up resentment. So the criteria in the political context are, I think, looser, or maybe broader is a better word, than they are in the interpersonal context, and that, I think, is appropriate to the differences between the two spheres. Political apology, too, rests on moral ideals, such as honesty, truth-telling, accountability, trustworthiness, peace and reconciliation, and the obligations of the powerful to those they govern, as well as the possibility of progress beyond war and violence. And consequently, political apology, too, values memory over forgetting. Keeping forgiveness and political apology distinct helps, I think, to prevent the politicizing of forgiveness, which I believe is a real danger. Imagine cases of forced professions of forgiveness, forced atonement, forced contrition. This is very, very easily lapsed into, and the force doesn't have to be at the wrong end of a gun. It can be done through kinds of social pressure, and those are corrupting of forgiveness, which is, in a deep sense, a transaction of the heart. It's very much about a change of self. So I think to talk about political forgiveness is to invite a corruption of the very notion of forgiveness. Political apology, I believe, is less susceptible to that, although it is susceptible to it. And consequently, it's very important to keep distinct forgiveness and political apology. Having said that, as you know, I've already acknowledged that apology does play a role in forgiveness, but that's not political apology, that's apology in an interpersonal context. Reconciliation is a term that can be understood in many different ways, from a very minimal way as the cessation of hostilities to full affirmation and endorsement. In the minimal sense of the term, it may not require forgiveness or apology. So criteria for truces, which can lead to reconciliation in this very minimal sense, may not involve forgiveness or apology at all. Finally, just to offer one last comment about this issue of imperfect or non-paradigmatic cases of forgiveness. These cases are, I think, deeply interesting and also complicated. One of the cases of imperfect forgiveness that I mentioned was self-forgiveness. And there are not only interesting metaphysical problems here about the identity of the self, but there are very interesting problems about what it would really mean to forgive yourself for harms not that you've done to others, since you may need to forgive yourself for harms done to others, but forgive yourself for harms that you have done to yourself. So the logic gets quite convoluted and complicated in such cases, which is one of the reasons why I see self-forgiveness, among others, as an instance of imperfect or non-paradigmatic forgiveness. So with that, I think I shall stop and pass the baton on to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Charles. What we're going to do is to keep going and do Julie and Nick, and then we'll open it up for what I'm sure will be a rich discussion, not only among the panelists, but among the members of the audience as well. So the next introduction via excerpt is of Julie Exline in a review of the social psychological literature on the interface between forgiveness and justice. Julie said the following: "Forgiveness can bring both benefits and risk for forgivers. By choosing to forgive, individuals can set aside potentially destructive feelings such as bitterness and hatred. Yet some have argued that principal feelings of resentment can be beneficial. In fact, it might actually be dangerous or morally remiss to set them aside. Expressions of forgiveness, although often facilitating reconciliation, might also create risk for offended parties. When considering how forgiveness unfolds for victims, the motivations underlying forgiveness decisions become important. Do people forgive to release themselves from discomfort, or do their decisions reflect more principled motives? Are such distinctions about motives important in terms of predicting outcomes for forgivers or offenders? These challenging questions merit further attention."
And I'm doing a PowerPoint, so I'm assuming I'm going up here to do this. Right. Just a second. I'm going to just pull up my flash drive because I don't know if it's loaded on this computer or not. My understanding was that it was, but I don't see it there on the desktop. That's Thursday. Okay, can you all hear me okay? All right, so my field is psychology. Actually, my degree's in clinical psychology, but a lot of my research has been more social, but my work is on the interface between the two. And actually, much of my work has been in the, what Dr. Griswold referred to as the non-paradigmatic cases. So a lot of my work has been on self-forgiveness. Anger at God is probably my primary area of research. A little bit on receiving God's forgiveness, some third-party forgiveness, and we're just getting started on something about forgiving people who've died. So a lot of the work doesn't fit neatly into the interpersonal category, but most of my major published work to date has been on the more the classic interpersonal side. So that's what I'm going to focus on here today. Also, because I'm a social scientist, people might be getting nervous that I'm going to show lots of scary scatter plots and statistics. And actually, my day-to-day life is full of those things. I'm a number cruncher. But in talks, I prefer to just give the concepts and the ideas. So you don't have to be frightened of that. Okay, what I'm going to do today is start by talking about what it means to forgive. And here, again, you'll see some overlap with the prior talk. Then I'm going to very briefly talk about a few major predictors of forgiveness that have been identified through research, although I won't go into the details of the research. Then I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons of anger and some of the important cautions surrounding forgiveness, and then some tips to facilitate it. And this is all going to be primarily from a psychological perspective. This is how a lot of social and clinical psychologists think about forgiveness. I'm not going to do a lot of direct applications to law. There'll be more of that coming this afternoon. So what is forgiveness? And at least in the psychology field, any good talk or paper about forgiveness starts with a discussion of what it is not. because we have to clarify that. So here, again, you'll see some overlap with the prior talk. So some very common misconceptions about what forgiveness is. So forgiveness does not, at least from a psych perspective, it doesn't imply that a person has to forget, excuse or condone. So you can see that we're on the same page here. It doesn't mean that you deny, minimize, or suppress your anger or pain. So you're not just sweeping it under the rug, which is a common misconception. Does it mean that you're going to be unassertive, that you're going to become a doormat who just gets walked on by other people? Very importantly, forgiveness doesn't imply that you trust the offender. And the blunt way that we sometimes refer to this is forgiving doesn't make you stupid. You don't suddenly put on these rose-colored glasses where you can no longer see people realistically. And some people aren't trustworthy. Also, it does not imply reconciliation. Now, I know that a part of what we're talking about here today are themes related to reconciliation, but I'm going to be talking about forgiveness specifically. And within psychology, we make quite a distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation, even though one often leads to the other. There are cases where you may choose to forgive someone, but not to resume the relationship. And abusive cases are classic examples of this, or certainly some criminal cases. And finally, forgiveness does not imply that you're necessarily going to fail to seek justice, particularly more restorative forms of justice, but there may be cases where retributive justice may still seem appropriate. So in fact, one way to think about it is that real forgiveness could promote the pursuit of justice, not vengeance, but true justice, wanting things to be done fairly. And if there is a successful pursuit of justice, that could feed back in to make forgiveness easier. So the two could work together. Sometimes people see them as being in conflict, and I don't believe that this is necessarily the case. So what does it mean to forgive when I'm talking about it as being something that could actually work with justice? This is a very psychological definition I'm going to be giving. It's also very intrapsychic. It's a very internal definition, not getting too much into the relational aspects here. So forgiveness might mean being able to reduce or eliminate resentful, bitter feelings and desires for revenge. So here we're really talking about something that's going on with your thoughts and your emotions. Often people describe forgiving in terms of being able to let go of their resentment about offenses. There's often an idea of release. Now, this next part is more controversial. Some people suggest that in order to forgive, you need to cultivate positive feelings or motives toward the offender. So it's not enough to just get rid of the negative, you actually need to feel positive. My colleague Everett Worthington has been a proponent of that view. But it's quite controversial. And personally, I think that sometimes there's a bit of a confound between forgiveness and love. Not romantic love, but something like altruistic love or agape love, where there are some cases where people will report a dramatic transformation in their feelings from negative to positive. In my opinion, some other process has kicked in there, like love for the other person that would kick it up into the positive area. Personally, my opinion is that in order to forgive, you don't necessarily have to go to the positive side of the equation. It's more about getting rid of the negative. But we are not all in agreement about that in psychology. So again, Everett Worthington did a nice job of explaining this idea of an injustice gap. And all this is a term to refer to the gap between how things actually are, so a wound that somebody experienced, an offense committed against someone, the gap between that and how they would be if things were fair. So the basic idea of the injustice gap is that forgiving requires us to sort of bridge this gap or jump over it. You know, you could use a couple of different metaphors to think about it, but you've got to get past that in some way. You've got to get past that injustice. And certainly the bigger the injustice gap, the harder forgiveness is going to be. On the next page, I'll just give a few examples of that. But there are some cases where forgiveness is really easy, almost a trivial thing. And generally, this is in cases that involve what we refer to as a small injustice gap. So this would be things like small unintentional offenses. You know, somebody steps on your foot. You know, some little thing that happens. Prompt and sincere apologies. There's tons and tons of evidence, research evidence, that apologies facilitate forgiveness. And particularly if they're sincere and you don't wait a long time before you offer them. It's extremely well documented. So that helps to reduce the sense of injustice because the perpetrator is, in a sense, paying back the victim in some way. So that reduces the injustice. And certainly if there's some sort of restitution. Even some punishment for the offender can help to restore a sense of justice, but there's actually some work showing that apologies are more effective than seeing somebody punished in terms of helping people forgive. But if all this stuff happens, these are relatively easy cases to forgive. So it's easy to get over the injustice gap when it's small. But what about the harder cases? And those are the cases that, for psychologists who work with people on forgiveness, you know, we don't tend to see people with those trivial offenses. We see much stickier situations. So let me just talk a little about the forgiveness process. Again, what you're going to see here is a pretty internal perspective compared to how you may be accustomed to thinking about it from a legal perspective. So for example, I'm going to be talking about this internal process of reducing angry and resentful feelings. Now, sometimes that is accompanied by expressions of forgiveness to the other person. Sometimes it's going to be accompanied by restitution, but not always. Those parts of it I'm not going to be focusing on, given the brief time here. And it might seem a little odd that in a talk about forgiveness, I'm going to start off talking about all the great things about anger. But actually, in a lot of the clinical work, particularly with women, we see that focusing on what's good about anger is a really, really important place to start so that people don't start getting into unassertive, nice behavior where they're just sweeping things under the rug. So a central thought here to start with is that anger has value. It's an indicator of what's important to people. People get angry about things that matter to them. I mean, although there are the exceptions of like the stubbing the toe, but the more serious, prolonged anger that people experience is usually a signal of what your deepest values are, what your goals are, what it is that you want. And anger, of course, is a very powerful signal of injustice. So anger has signal value. You don't want to just ignore it and say, oh, it's a bad thing, let's suppress it. Anger can also energize people, and it makes people feel strong and safe. So a lot of times there is an underlying feeling of being wounded or damaged or very vulnerable. And it often feels a lot safer for people to be angry than it does to acknowledge the more vulnerable feelings underneath, feelings like hurt. And with anger, you can feel strong and you can feel like you're in the right. And there's something to be said for that in some situations. So even if forgiveness is a good thing, this does not imply that anger is a bad thing. And most clinicians focusing on this would say, before trying to forgive, it's really important to be able to acknowledge the anger and perhaps even validate it and the reasons behind it. Because people often have good reasons for being angry. The problems seem to occur, at least, again, from a psychological perspective, the problems don't come up with that initial flash of anger unless you behave really aggressively or do something destructive in the moment. Usually the problems occur more when anger settles in for a longer stay. So anger can become an oppressive burden where it feels like something that somebody is just dragging around. Angry rumination, which is a key part of unforgiveness, where it's like your mind is in this spin cycle and you just go over and over and over and over and you keep getting more and more angry. That's a torment. We often think of it as a spin cycle or like a broken record where you just can't get your mind off the offense. And this is something very commonly happens in cases of offense. People will often talk about anger as something that is initially energizing but then turns to bitterness after time, where it used to energize you, but then it becomes like a poison. There's a kind of a famous saying, unforgiveness is a poison that we give ourselves to drink. Often we're the ones being harmed by our unforgiveness, and we're the ones getting eaten up by the bitterness, but yet we think we're doing it to get the other person, but often it's just all inside. Certainly, anger that doesn't get resolved can lead to escalations of conflict, interpersonal or intergroup, and hatred toward other people or groups. Spiritual struggles as well. If people feel that forgiving is the morally appropriate thing to do, and they find themselves unwilling to do it or perhaps unable, this could lead to struggles in terms of, say, a person's perceived relationship with God or their religious group. And finally, there can be physical health problems from the stress of prolonged anger. So there's good research suggesting that people who are chronically angry tend to suffer problems both in their cardiovascular systems, their immune systems, and it increases the risk of early mortality. So basically, it reaches a point where the anger drags people down. It used to be something that kept them feeling strong and like they could fight, and now it starts to drag down. So what I'm going to talk about now are just a few steps that psychologists might recommend going through. This is assuming that you do have a case where you have looked at the anger and aren't quite sure if you want to forgive or not. We wouldn't recommend with jumping in with forgiveness. We would say, let's sort through those painful emotions and see what you come up with. Okay, so look at it. What was the real offense here? And what might be a distortion or an overreaction? So one thing that comes up here is that excessive anger in response to an offense can be a signal of some kind of old, unhealed wound in somebody's life. So somebody might be really sensitive, for example, about their weight or about being accused of being sloppy or a procrastinator or something like that. It's just a sore spot for them. So it doesn't take much for somebody else to kind of trip over that and end up with an explosion of anger from a person where it seems kind of out of proportion. Another area where you'll see kind of overreactions of anger and hatred, it's not listed actually on the PowerPoint. It's in cases of envy. Envy is such a socially unacceptable emotion that people are incredibly adept at transforming it into justified resentment. So people won't say, I'm envious of that person. They'll say, I hate that person's guts because of all their unfair advantages. She just got to the top, but she must have been sleeping with the boss. People are very quick to find ways to justify the strong negative feelings that are really rooted in envy. So that's another example. But a lot of times you really have to sort through this and think, what am I really mad about? And is this something that's justified? There are cases where confrontation of the other party or justice seeking might be highly appropriate. And we would actually recommend doing that before you start getting on with the business of forgiveness. This is where your anger could actually serve you well. A crucial thing, how can the offended party be protected from future harm, especially if you're talking about a legal situation where somebody could be in real danger? What lessons can be learned from the anger? And is it time to let go of it or not yet? So I would suggest that there's a lot of benefit in really asking these questions and going through this. And in fact, a lot of the people that I've worked with clinically on forgiveness, we never got to the forgiveness. We spent a lot of time here trying to help people feel okay with being angry. Because again, with women in particular, there's a real reluctance to go there and to feel the anger. And women tend to want to suppress it and get rid of it and just be nice. So the next set of strategies I'm going to give you are, assuming you actually want to forgive, here's what you're going to do. But if you get into these prematurely, they may increase the risk of being victimized again, or just suppressing or swallowing your emotions. So this is stuff you want to only get into if you're really ready. First thing is to keep pride in balance. one thing that's very clear from the literature, and something we've looked at a bit in our own work, is that people who've been hurt or offended want to save face. They want to feel strong again. They may want to get back a socially dominant position and pursue their rights. And all those things may be beneficial personally at some level, but they're going to be barriers to forgiveness and apology. You know, all the stuff about self-interest is going to get in the way of forgiving, unless you're just purely forgiving to avoid having a heart attack or something. There's a quality called narcissistic entitlement that we kind of beat to death in a 6-study paper in Journal of Personality and Social Psych a few years ago, making it very clear that this impedes forgiveness. Narcissistic entitlement is a quality of people who think that they're special and they're better than other people and the rules don't apply to them. And I'm sure none of you have ever met anyone like this, and you've never had any students like this in your classes or anything like that. Definitely something that gets in the way of forgiveness. Like I said, we really beat that one to death. It's quite clear that it impedes forgiveness. So pride gets in the way. But at the same time, healthy self-respect is a good thing. So you don't want to be telling people to just start feeling lousy about themselves. So to avoid these extremes of arrogance on the one hand and unassertiveness on the other, we would suggest cultivating an attitude of self-compassion. My colleague Kristen Neff has done some great work on this, or humility, which is basically being able to look at your strengths and weaknesses in an even-handed way and not overreact to them, and to see the good and bad aspects of human nature and how you're connected to other people through these things. Also being able to look at all human beings as having limitations, that we all do things that hurt others, can be helpful. Take a little more universal view. And along with that come some of these other ideas about broadening your perspective. When people have been hurt, they tend to get kind of a tunnel vision. You get into that rumination, this person hurt me, I can't believe they did this, I can't believe they did this, I didn't deserve this. Being able to open up your mind can help with the forgiving. So one thing that's been well documented, many studies, is that being able to empathize or see the situation from the other person's point of view tends to reduce anger. There's also a technique we looked at in another 7-study paper, so we beat this one to death pretty well too. We call the personal capability technique. And this is just that if people can imagine or recall a time when they did something similar, they're going to be more forgiving. Now, obviously, if somebody's been raped or had a family member murdered or something, they may not be able to reach inside themselves and imagine themselves ever doing something like that. But so there are boundary conditions on this. With a lot of everyday offenses, it can be pretty effective to think, I've done things like this. And this seems to be particularly helpful for men, these types of empathy exercises. Also, it's important to be able to warm up your attitudes toward the offender somehow. So the ones I just described were like humbling strategies, not letting pride get in the way. And then the empathizing strategies tend to kind of shrink the size of the offense. So they help to shrink the injustice in your mind. Then there's warming up your attitudes toward the offender is another helpful technique. Now, something you could do with just about anyone, depending on your view of human nature, would be to reflect on the offender's inherent value and dignity as a member of the human race. So try to foster a sense of connection. We're all human beings. Human beings make mistakes. There's research showing that this type of thinking, even if you're just asked to do it as part of an experiment, can help you to forgive. Now, in some relationships, you can also reflect on positive qualities or good past experiences with the other person. This would work very well in a marriage, for example. But those types of techniques might not work if the offender is a stranger or an archenemy, as you might often run into in, say, a criminal legal situation. And finally, in many cases of forgiveness, people talk about a conscious act of letting go. This doesn't always happen. Sometimes people just wake up one day and say, I don't hate my father anymore. But often there's a conscious act of letting go of those cold, bitter, vengeful feelings. And sometimes imagery can really help people to do this. Now, this might sound corny, but it does seem to help for some people. So people might picture themselves like breaking free from the chains that are binding them, of this anger, setting down this burden they've been carrying around, or maybe releasing the problem to a higher power like God or the universe. But even if you do all of this, A very common pattern is that people will forgive and then find that their anger flares up again. So they say, I thought that I forgave that person. What happened? Well, when this happens, simply repeat the process. And it should become gradually easier with time. People often, again, clinically talk about forgiveness more like a spiral, where it's really hard and your anger level's very hard the first time through, very high. And then the second time through, you might get angry, but it's not quite as much as before. And then not quite as much as before. But often you have to go over the same ground multiple times. So a quick summary. Anger is a natural response to injustice, especially when that injustice gap is large. It might be a very justifiable response. But the prolonged grudge holding can be harmful, psychologically, emotionally, socially, spiritually. And if forgiveness is the definite goal, those humbling, shrinking, and warming strategies that I talked about might help to facilitate it. And finally, forgiveness is often a process rather than a one-time event. Okay, so that's my very quick look at a psychological perspective on the internal process of forgiveness. And I'm also happy to talk to people more later about anger at God or this other stuff if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for those psychological insights. And now to Nick Smith, who actually wrote the book on apology. In a commentary on apologies in criminal law, Nick said, if religion and its practices of repentance once provided the backdrop that framed our understandings of apologies, law increasingly plays that role in modern life. Apologies in both civil and criminal law pull in opposite directions. On the one hand, certain kinds of apologies admit guilt, whether in criminal hearings, corporate settlement negotiations, or malpractice litigation. Admitting guilt is often equivalent to accepting complete defeat. Providing what I describe as a categorical apology can amount to legal suicide within an adversarial justice system. On the other hand, some apologies provide an astoundingly successful means of mollifying disputants. A strategically timed and worded apology can prevent litigation altogether, reduce damage payments and jury awards by considerable amounts, or shave years from prison sentences. An apology can accomplish nearly all the objectives of reconciliation, redress, and punishment, but only if it rises to the level of what I describe as a categorical apology.
Thanks, Calvin. Thanks for having me here. I agree with much of what Charles and Julie have already said. I'm going to try to emphasize the points of disagreement because that's usually the more interesting and fun part to talk about. There is the same handout that Charles's information was on, mine is on as well. I'm not going to get through all of it, but I'll talk for about 20 minutes about generally what I'm up to, how I conceptualize apologies, and how I imagine in one case that framework would apply to criminal law. I published a book on apologies titled I Was Wrong about a year ago, which lays out the framework for moral meaning of apologies, and I'm working right now on the follow-up to that book, which applies that framework for apologetic meaning to various kinds of cases in law, criminal law, civil law, international law. If you look at letter B on this handout, what that is sort of the table of contents from that first book, so you can get a sense for the sorts of things that I'm thinking about. The first half of that book considers apologies between individuals. And what I do initially is try to lay out a framework for the sorts of meanings that I think we're typically looking for in apologies. And I find that apologies have dozens, if not hundreds, of different kinds of meanings and uses. And that I'm a philosopher by training, I have a law degree as well, but typically when folks study apologies, they operate with what I call a binary model, which means sort of typically that when people view apologies, they sort of tend to apply a yes or no test. Either I have or have not received an apology. I find that to be terribly distorting and actually ends up being abusive in many cases. What I prefer to do, instead of just evaluating, is this an apology or not, or is this a successful apology or not, is try to parse all the different sorts of ways that apologies have meaning, such that in any given case we can identify what kinds of meaning we're looking for in any given with any given injury. It is immensely complicated in terms of the moral criteria and the social contexts in which our conceptions of what a good apology is arise. I think these are very long traditions. Right now we're sort of thinking, many of us are operating with secular notions of apologies. These, I think, are indisputably derived from ancient religious traditions that have evolved over time. The very term apology has, when we think of, it's sort of ironic that if any of you have ever taken a philosophy class, one of the first things you read is Plato's Apology, which is exactly the opposite of what we would now think of as an apology. In ancient Greece, the word apologia was a formal legal defense. Right? I am not guilty, I am not blameworthy, and here's why. Somehow over a few thousand years, it's evolved into the opposite. It's a complex cultural soup, and I'm trying to tease out the kinds of meaning that are at stake. And I will spend most of my time talking about what sorts of things are in play for me, but I wanted to walk through the other ways that I'm thinking about apology in the chapters of that book, in addition to thinking about the meanings of apology and what I call the elements of a categorical apology. A categorical apology is my term for apologies that rise to sort of the highest bar, what we might think of as a paradigmatic case or a full apology or something along those lines. I'm not particularly wedded to how we describe it, but what I'm doing is setting a bar at a certain level. We could raise that bar, we could lower that bar in any given case. There's no sort of universal truth to the account I'm giving. I think it's a pretty compelling standard to set that we can sort of begin the conversation about what we mean by an apology. I consider the role of apologies in gender, I have a chapter on. There is lots of social scientific research that seems to claim that women apologize more than men. I find that, unfortunately, even though intuitively that seems right to me, the social science is completely unconvincing. I find because most of the social scientific studies don't have a very clear sense for the conceptual framework for what an apology actually is, and they tend to sort of read transcripts, etc., and find that women say the word sorry more than men. So even if I'm saying I'm sorry you're such an idiot, that counts as an apology. So I'd like to see more social scientific studies that actually take a more rigorous conceptual framework into account, because I think there's a lot to be said about apologies in gender. I'm just not convinced by the work of Deborah Tannen and people like that it's giving a very convincing account. I consider the role of apologies in various cultural and religious traditions. The notion, that word apology has quite different resonances in different cultures, in different religious traditions. I think it would be a terrible mistake to try to isolate apologies as some sort of acontextual metaphysical thing. It is sort of born out of all sorts of different kinds of traditions that disagree. Even within the Christian tradition, there are all sorts of competing, as Charles was talking about earlier, competing conceptions of what apologies and forgiveness mean within that tradition, all of which are important, contested, but it's a sort of a complex cultural soup. For example, in Japanese culture, the idea of an apology would look oftentimes very different from what we would consider an apology, because there's this tradition of thinking of apologies and gratitude along a spectrum, such that if you were to if it was an occasion of celebration, my birthday or something, and you were to give me a nice gift, I might apologize to you for giving me a gift because I'm thinking that, in a way, I've put you out, right? Right? I'm inconveniencing you, so I'm sorry that I've required you to give me such a nice gift, right? So an apology would be an appropriate expression of gratitude, which is in a way quite different from what many of you probably have in your mind an apology is. And I think being insensitive to those cultural nuances can make quite a mess, whether it's in personal cases of apologies or in political cases of apology. I consider unusual cases. I have a whole chapter devoted to apologizing to animals, infants, machines. You apologize to your laptop when you drop it or something. Apologizing to the dead and apologizing to yourself. My conclusions in all those cases are that it makes good sense to apologize to all sorts of things. It may not rise to the level of a categorical apology, but there is a place for getting certain kinds of meanings out of apologies in these what people might call non-paradigmatic cases that can be quite important. I consider the relation between apologies and forgiveness. I tend to find apologies, as I've already mentioned, terribly messy and complicated. I think forgiveness is equally complicated, and the relationship between them is a magnificent mess. And if I can do nothing else, I hope to cause trouble on that front, to ask more questions and to problematize the frameworks that are out there regarding the relationship between them. I end up naming a dozen or so sorts of apologies and a typology of sort of a classification system for apologies that it helps identify the sorts of apologies that are out there and that tend to get used. The paradigmatic case is what I call a categorical apology, but there are all sorts of different kinds of apologies that are useful in different sorts of contexts. Not every apology needs to be categorical. In some cases, you can settle for something much less, much different, and it'll be just as appropriate. The second half of that book is on collective apologies. So apologies from nations, corporations, families. This is immensely complex. If you've already got sort of the complexities regarding questions of apologies between individuals, the simplest cases, once you start talking, for example, about, imagine Barack Obama apologizing for the war in Iraq. Okay? The levels of complexity that would be at stake there, right? For someone, for example, that may accept no personal blame, right? He may think that he did everything right at that time, and he's apologizing for others. And it may be that, right, 51% of the U.S. population thinks that apologizing is a good idea, 49% doesn't. Thinking about how, or what sorts of meanings a collective apology might convey, I spend a few hundred pages trying to sort through that. Let me talk a little bit now about the elements of a categorical apology. Keeping in mind that there are lots of different varieties of apologies, the categorical is one variety that I think of as the fullest, most morally robust, but not the only kind. And I'm not comfortable saying that if you don't rise to the level of a categorical apology, you haven't apologized. That sort of slips back into that binary language that I find distorting and unhelpful. The first thing I look for in a categorical or full apology is what I call a corroborated factual record, meaning that the apologizer tells the story of what happened in an appropriate degree of detail that identifies all the morally salient things that happened. In many cases for people, this is the most important bit of the apology, especially in cases of collective violence, collective apologies. People want to know what happened with some precision. Right? So whatever is important, we want to hear the story told about, right, what did you do? Important for me is this often includes telling the story about your intentions and your mind frame at the time of the offense. What you often find in apologies that are unsuccessful or unsatisfying in various ways is people trying to claim that their wrongdoing was an accident or unintentional. So in cases of sort of the most grotesque forms of racism, people will say, it wasn't my intention to offend anyone, or if anyone happened to be offended by my amazingly racist things, it wasn't my intention. Giving a clear accounting for what you were actually thinking and what motivated your wrongdoing is usually quite an important part of this historical record to make the mental states clear. 2, an acceptance of blame. This, for many, is a central feature for what we're looking for, is instead of just saying that He'd say, I am sorry that your grandmother died. Right? An expression of empathy or something like that. Very different to say, I'm sorry I killed your grandmother. Right? And I accept blame for your grandmother's death. We can immediately appreciate sort of the important moral distinctions between accepting blame and expressing sympathy or something like that. Central to a categorical apology is this acceptance of blame. I'm using blame with some precision as opposed to saying accepting responsibility. Responsibility is a word that has many different kinds of meaning that don't always mean blame. Right? So if Obama were to apologize for the war in Iraq, he could say, I accept responsibility for the situation in Iraq, even though I'm not responsible for it and blame, right? I don't deserve any blame for it, right? I can be responsible sort of in terms of my duties, right? If I'm a janitor, I may be responsible for cleaning up someone else's mess. Very different from saying that I deserve blame, right, for creating that mess. Possession of appropriate standing, meaning the person who's apologizing is the one who deserves blame, different from sort of third party, right? If I do something naughty and my mother apologizes for me, we can immediately appreciate that that's quite different from me accepting blame, right? Sort of my mother could apologize for my bad behavior by saying, I tried to raise them better, but right, I made all these mistakes and I deserve blame for that. Maybe I wasn't present. Right? She could apologize specifically perhaps for her role in my naughtiness, right? But it's a different kind of apology if I'm accepting blame for what I'm doing, right? And appreciating that difference, I think is important to many of us. It becomes especially problematic in cases of collective apologies, or in cases where the primary wrongdoers are long dead, right? In my view, there are lots of cases where categorical apologies are impossible because the primary wrongdoer is dead and certain meaning can never be recovered, and that's unfortunate, but I think fudging and acting as if we have this categorical apology when in fact the wrongdoer went to her grave unrepentant, I'm keen on parsing those distinctions. Identification of each harm, number 4. A lot of times when we apologize, we tend to conflate a whole set of harms into one vague apology. So for example, if my wife and I are having some kind of argument about me not taking out the trash, and I lie to her and I say, honey, I didn't take out the trash because the dog ran out of the house and I was chasing him and I just couldn't get to the trash and there's so many other things going on and I'm lying about this, right? Or I'm saying, I had a really important phone call when actually I was just being lazy and didn't feel like taking out the trash. Now I've both, right, not honored my domestic duties, I've lied to my wife, I've compounded, right? There's a whole sort of set of harms, different kinds of wrongdoing, right? I've disrespected her time, I've lied to her, I've not sort of participated in my family work. Very different kinds of wrongs, and identifying each one rather than sort of conflating them all and saying, honey, I'm sorry. Right? Something as ambiguous and vague that doesn't name all the offenses can be quite important to tease out all the different kinds of wrongdoing in cases of collective violence, for example. Or if we were to imagine, say, some kind of apology for African slavery, we can start to imagine the range of moral wrongs that would need to be named. Right? You probably hit just about everything wrong that a human could do would need to be named in a categorical apology for African slavery, right? Because there's so many different kinds of wrongdoing, each of which is significant and important. An important part of that number 4 is identifying the right wrong as opposed to the wrong wrong, because oftentimes we will apologize for the lesser offense. A famous example of this is when Governor Schwarzenegger apologized for, I think it was 8 or 9 women accused him of sexual harassment. And his response was, he publicly apologizes and he says, I acted badly. Okay? I acted badly. And they were wild movie sets and, crazy things happen. Okay? He doesn't actually name the wrong with any degree of specificity. We're wondering, right, we want some kind of, first, what exactly happened? Did you harass these women or not? What is your notion of sort of inappropriate behavior? He actually uses it as he uses the allegations of sexual harassment actually to amplify his machismo, right? That he was on the sort of wild, rowdy, hypersexualized movie sets, and he was just kind of, right, big man on campus in these sets. So he actually uses his apology to sort of raise his public image, which is perverse and wild, yet he gets moral credit on some fronts for giving an apology for those. An even more egregious case is in the Catholic Church sex abuse scandals. There was one member of the clergy who, instead of apologizing for sexually abusing children, he apologized for breaking his vow of celibacy. Right? And we can appreciate most of us probably don't really care very much about his vow of celibacy. We care about the fact that he was a sexual predator on children, right? Naming the wrong, naming the lesser offense, right? We act as if, well, he's apologized, so he gets moral credit and we can move on and forgive. I'd like to see more precision in those cases. 5, identifying the moral principles underlying the harm. It's not just that we name the harm as such. We do some work to explain why the harm is a harm, which I think is essential to our public moral discourse. So, for example, if we go back to the trash example in my family, it's not about the trash. It's not about me taking out the trash. It's about me respecting my wife's time. It's about the core values of our marriage, right? Our union, that we sort of live together, we build our relationship around these values. And when I give some off-the-cuff, unthoughtful apology that doesn't use the opportunity to explain sort of why I think what I've done is wrong and why, and I'll talk about this later, why I won't do it again, those are occasions to redeem our core moral values and to have that conversation about, very basically and fundamentally, what we stand for and what we believe in, and why when we wrong and we breach those values, we are not the people we want to be. Right? In my view, apologies are sort of profound moral and existential moments when we sort of take up our core values and have conversations about who we are, what we want to be, how we've failed. That relates to 6, the shared commitment to the underlying moral principle, because there are many cases where I could recognize that I've offended you, I could recognize the moral principle that I've breached and that you think I've breached, yet I think it's stupid, and I don't agree with your moral principle. So, for example, if my aunt takes offense that I used the wrong fork to eat my salad, and she's offended and she casts me out of the house because I don't know cutlery etiquette, I could say, actually I think that's classist and racist, and I'm not going to honor your value even though I know that's your value. It's important not just to identify the value, to know that someone was wrong, but if you disagree about the core value, to not just apologize for it and act as if you disagree, but to have that moral conversation about the disagreements. I think this is one of the crises of modern life, is that we lack that public discourse when we don't share values, and we pretend as if when we're in this sort of difficult interplay within multicultural pluralism, when we're negotiating what values we stand for, what values we don't, apologies are one occasion to have those conversations. Number 7, recognition of the victim as the moral interlocutor. For some people, this will be the most important bit of an apology, when we take someone who we may have previously thought of just as a means to our end, someone who we may not have thought was worthy of treating as someone with dignity. When we go to them, undertake this process whereby we have a conversation about our moral values and we recognize their worth as humans, most basically. It sort of may sound Kantian in tenor, it isn't necessarily that. But simply, even if someone steps on your toe, if someone steps on your toe and they don't recognize that you're something more than a piece of furniture, right? Part of the quick apology, sorry, I stepped on your toe. A lot of that is about seeing that you're not just a piece of furniture. You are a human, and I've, maybe in a very minor way wronged you, but you are in fact a human, and I have to recognize you as such, rather than pretending like you don't exist. Number 8, categorical regret. Categorical regret is this idea that it's not just that I think it's unfortunate that bad things came from my action and my decision, so that I could be the the bombardier of the Enola Gay and think, it's really unfortunate that I dropped the bomb and all those people died. That's not categorical regret. If under the same circumstance I would do it again, categorical regret means I think I've made a mistake. I believe I've made a mistake. In a way, I wish I could turn back time because I recognize now that something I did was wrong, was a moral failure, was a mistake. It's not just regret, like, it's regrettable that there were collateral damages. Right? It's the idea that what I've done is actually a kind of mistake that I wish I could undo. Performance of the apology, right, it has to actually be done. It's a dialectical process. There are various kinds of ways that it can be engaged. I tend to prefer, given that I think apologies are rather complex interactions, I prefer them to be in writing as well as performed, because there's a lot of nuances, and oftentimes when we're apologizing, we are sort of in emotional fits and starts, and we don't give it enough time to be reflective about the content of the apology. Reform and redress. Number 10, I take categorical apologies as a promise to forbear from reoffending over a lifetime. I promise I'm never going to do it again. If I reoffend, right? So if I give this wonderfully eloquent apology and I shed tears and I sort of do all the other things up to now, and then I do it again tomorrow, we can appreciate how so much of the meaning is going to be drained, right? In many cases, you may want only number 10, right? I don't care about the rest. I don't want to have a moral conversation with you. Get out of my face. Just don't ever do it again. Right? I want a promise from you, never going to do it again. All the rest is gravy. What I really want to know is that I'm safe from you and don't do it again. Right? That promise, I think of apologies as a kind of promise. One of the sort of theoretically difficult consequences of this is that you can't evaluate apologies in the moment they're given very thoroughly. Right? So someone could give a wonderful apology at time X, and then at time X plus 1, reoffend, and the apology loses as much of its meaning. I don't think of apologies as speech acts, primarily, which much of the philosophical tradition does. I think the actual language is just the tip of the iceberg. I view promises to reform, apologies, etc. I use the analogy if someone were to say, I love you on the first date. Interesting, right? But I can't make much of it until I see how you act towards me for a while, right? I want to see how you perform. Because if you say you love me on the first date and then you never call me back, I'm going to realize, not so much meaning there, right? I want to see the performance over a lifetime. Now, this makes it difficult and unfortunate because, and I'll talk about this in a minute in criminal context, I can't evaluate it at the moment it's given. It's not a quick and dirty, clean, perfect apology, I can forgive, move on, let's close that chapter. It's a lifetime process, and you can very easily take away so much of the meaning by reoffending. And it's inconvenient. It would be nice if we could just sort of look into someone's soul and know, right, the future and know their emotions and know all that, but we can't. And it's theoretically inconvenient that that's the case, but I think that's the only clear-minded way to think about this. In addition to promising to forbear from reoffending, there is a commitment to redress. I use redress rather than the various other words like compensation, etc., because I think oftentimes there is a kind of metaphysical mistake we make in forgiveness that certain kinds of redress, remediation, are commensurate with the damage, so that if I cause X harm and I give you Y compensation, that somehow erases the injury or provides perfect conversation for the injury, and we balance the scales of justice and somehow can close the chapter. I think all of that metaphysical language is very distorting. I think there is no way to erase the past or close a chapter, and there are no commensurable remedies. You do what you can that has meaning, that is somehow appropriate. You can't bring back the dead. You can't forget the past. It would. I like the idea of redress as a sort of less incommensurable term. The intentions for apologizing are important because, to me, and I think to many readers, it seems quite important why I'm apologizing. If I am, for example, the CEO of a corporation involved in class action litigation, and I apologize simply to achieve some competitive advantage in settlement negotiations, or if I apologize on my marriage because, I think it'll get me what I want in the conversation, as opposed to apologizing because I am honoring some value. I'm honoring the person who was injured, right? If I'm using apology as a mere strategic tool, for many, if we realize that that's why you're apologizing, a lot of the meaning will be lost. Right? In a categorical apology, we apologize in large part in sort of the deontological sense that we're honoring the value at stake and we're honoring the person who was injured. Lastly, the emotional content of a categorical apology is, in a way, I think my best bit of evidence for why I don't like the binary model of apologies. Again, the binary model is this idea that either you do apologize or you don't, or you've successfully apologized or you haven't. In the case of emotions, most of us will realize that apologies have to have some emotional content, right? Because if someone goes through all these steps and they just seem like a robot when they're doing it, they don't feel any guilt, they don't seem to feel anything, something's going to seem missing, sort of obviously missing. Even if they go through all the other steps and they sort of do it by the book and they read Nick Smith's book and they sort of go through all the steps, but they're just, nothing seems to be inside. They don't seem to feel the right way. We'll appreciate that something is missing. But the idea of somehow quantifying, right, that you need to feel, right, 20 units of guilt at time 1 in order to have categorically apologized, right? The very idea of quantifying or setting some level for what sort of, how long do you need to feel which emotions in order to have successfully apologized, that's a game I'm not willing to play. Because in part, is it just that you need to feel X quanta of guilt when you're saying the apology, and then 48 hours later you can, experience X minus 5 quanta of guilt because the guilt's waning? Do you need to feel that guilt for the rest of your life? Can you only feel it in the moment? Oftentimes when we apologize, it's a mix of conflicting emotions, because I might, on the one hand, feel guilt. On the other hand, I might feel great pride because I'm someone who is accepting blame, undergoing a moral transformation, and I could take pride in myself in being a good apologizer. So I'm unwilling to say that, right, there's, you need X number of units of Y emotions over Z duration in order to apologize effectively. That just seems like a dead end. I mean, maybe with better brain science in the future, we can have more robust conversations about that. But I'm not willing to go down that path. In summary of that bit, categorical apologies are a high bar. They're what I call full, robust, morally meaningful. I think there's some implicit sense in culture, given our moral traditions, that this is what we're looking for in serious cases. Not all apologies need to be categorical. They can have any number of elements. What I'm primarily trying to do is lay out a framework that empowers both the injured and the apologizers to know what kinds of meanings apologies can give, to give them a sense for the way apologies work within culture, and to give them a sense of the moral terrain, such that we can navigate it. Because in different cases, we might not want a categorical apology. We might have particular emphasis on one form or other. But I am, rather worried about cases where people want apologies, but they don't know what they want, and they are deceived because Attorney Y is able to give an apology that looks like a sort of fully robust, morally meaningful apology, but in actuality, it's a carefully constructed, carefully calibrated way to seem empathetic while not accepting blame, to shield themselves from liability in the best possible way while minimizing litigation risks. There are courses right now, for example, at Johns Hopkins Medical School that teach doctors to do things just like this, because the Toro lawnmower manufacturer early on realized that lawnmowers, lots of injuries, they were having catastrophic liability. They took the litigation strategy of let's just apologize without expressing blame, and let's see what happens in all these cases. And something like 90% of their damages went down. And people realized, wow, this is quite innovative. If we can just act sympathetic, don't admit responsibility or blame, most people on the street are going to go away. And when I think of those victims, right, people who are losing limbs, children dying, right, who are getting duped by corporate attorneys who are able to manipulate language of contrition just enough, sort of, maximize their profits. That's the sort of thing I'm trying to protect against. Just the second half of this, and I'm not gonna talk through it, is an application of this to cases of sentencing. We can imagine how, right, if a criminal defendant were to give something like a categorical apology, in a way, all of the objectives of punishment have been satisfied. Right? She's promised not to reoffend. She's undergone a profound moral transformation that really makes incarceration moot. Right? When we think of early American penology, right, the idea of the penitentiary as a place of penance, right, a place where you went and sat with your Bible to sort of, right, re-ground yourself morally and to undergo moral transformation. That notion of the penitentiary is sort of honored by the genuinely categorically apologetic victim. Yet there are all these complex practical issues that arise that I've laid out, and you can sort of read them if they interest you. It's the sort of stuff I'm working on in the next book. But if, for example, I deny my culpability, the court finds me guilty, and then at sentencing I say, well, I'm apologizing now in a categorical way. Here is exactly what happened. I am blameworthy. I'm guilty in all these ways because the court's already found me so I might as well give up that. Okay? If I'm apologizing at that stage of the proceedings in order to minimize my punishment, we can see how, right, we're inviting a parade of defendants who have been coached by attorneys, defense attorneys, who are consultants in these areas and know how to apologize just the right way to stroke the judge's conscience. How do we judge the quality of an apology in criminal justice systems? Right, a lot of it is judgments of interior mental states that we are notorious. I mean, we always judge mental states in criminal contexts now. The very idea of mens rea, we try to look into the mind of offenders. But even more difficult in the case of apologies, because we know if someone is just sort of, jumping through the hoops of what the court is looking in order to have their sentence reduced. Right now, the federal sentencing guidelines allow you to downwardly depart significantly if you express remorse. It gives very little guidelines regarding what that means. So now we have basically, cowboy judges thinking, well, you look repentant to me, right? Or the words you said, sort of, you hit the right notes in my mind. And that's it, right? There's very little guidelines, and this makes a considerable difference in sentencing. And I'm trying to give sort of a more sort of careful analytic framework for what judges should be looking for. One of the main problems is if it's true that one of the main features and one of the most important features of a categorical apology is this promise not to reoffend, right? One of the things courts are most considerate of, conscious of, is recidivism rates. If we can't judge that, as I claim, in the moment the apology is given, right, what sort of predictors do we have? How do we evaluate the quality of an apology? Because it's right, what you say in the courtroom at sentencing is only a very small slice, the tip of the iceberg regarding the quality of your apology. How do we adjust your sentence based on, right, your future performance and what kinds of, whether you keep your promise or not? Right? Who should be the judge of the quality of your apology? Should it be the court? Should it be people who are trained in this meaning? Should it be the victim? Right? All sorts of morally laden practical questions that speak to criminal procedure. The very fact that these are rather involved, right? An apology on my account is a rather complicated process when you think of the actual nuts and bolts of criminal procedure in 2009. It's an assembly line. And there is no opportunity for things like this. And in most cases, victims never meet their offenders. Right? In most cases, in order for an offender to apologize to the victim, she'd have to literally turn her back on the judge in court, right? Find the victim sort of somewhere in the courtroom, and that would be their only occasion to speak to the victim as a moral interlocutor. So there's all these sort of morally laden procedural questions that I'm interested in writing on. You can read whatever might interest you in the rest of this handout, and I'll stop there so we can start arguing a bit.
Thank you, Nick, for unearthing the multifaceted nature of the apology. Okay, what we're going to do is to open it up now for questions and exchange of ideas within and among all of us. And we'll run until 11:45, at which time we will break for lunch, grab a lunch, bring it back in, and come in for Jen Emrich's lecture during the luncheon hour. Okay, so questions, comments? Yes. Let's use the mic so that...
I don't need, I speak loud enough. So,
well, but it's being webcasted.
okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Hopefully, my comments will lead to further discussion. This past week, I reread Plato's Republic, the first book, where Socrates is speaking of justice and how justice differs depending on the person's point of view. And through his questioning of another citizen of Athens, Socrates talks about the unjust man actually claiming more rights than the just man, and clinging to those rights and clinging to his anger. Sort of the narcissistic person that Professor Exline was speaking to. And this type of person, he will struggle to keep his rights and struggle even though he is maybe really the more of the offender than the victim. I always have a hard time when I go down to exercise at my place of work and somebody's watching one of these Judge Judy shows or Judge Brown, and these are those type of narcissistic people who are clinging to their rights in anger and often view themselves as victims when they themselves are often maybe more of the offender. And that's where with Professor Griswold's comments, I know there can be situations when you have the innocent, where there is actually an innocent victim, but so often in our society, the victim and offender are blurred. Just in the situation with with Socrates talking about the unjust man seeking advantage over the just man and clinging to his own view that he's been wrong when he is actually more of the offender. And even in those situations where there is truly an innocent victim, I think that innocent victim can have a say how conflict can be resolved. So I do see a problem in the sort of paradigm of the innocent victim and the wrongdoer, because it's often blurred. And to reach to really truly reach a resolution and forgiveness, I think we got to get away from that paradigm of offender and innocent victim.
Reactions?
In the studies that we've done of both apology and forgiveness, when we ask people to recall times that they've hurt someone else or that someone else has hurt them, at least half the time the offenses that people recall are mutual. So it does set up the types of complicated dynamics that you're talking about. I think it gets complex at a conceptual level to try to handle all of those interpersonal things that get tangled up when somebody is both victim and offender, but I definitely agree that in real life that's much the way it is. Also, a flip side to what you were saying about the entitled person tending to blame others for things and not taking on their own responsibility for it. A parallel sort of tragedy can occur where often people who are quite innocent victims, if they are prone to guilt themselves or are very conscientious, they can end up feeling like they really were the transgressor. Again, say going back to an abusive relationship, where somebody ends up being abused, and then getting blamed for it. Well, you provoked me. And this very conscientious, guilt-prone person would say, oh, it's all my fault. So it's easy to see how in certain types of relationships where you've got one person who's more dominant and one who's more submissive, that the submissive person can end up feeling all this false guilt and be the one doing all the apologizing when really it's the other person who's the aggressor.
Just to follow up on that, thank you for your very interesting comment. If I could just address several different parts of it. With respect to the Platonic context, it's interesting to remember that Socrates himself never got angry. And when he was before the jury of Athens and they're condemning him to death, and by the way, actually quite painful death, because hemlock was a painful way to die, he says, you're wrong. What you're doing is unjust, my fellow citizens, but I'm not mad at you. And the reason I'm not mad at you is because you can't harm me. You can kill me, but you can't harm me. The reason you can't harm me is because I'm a good man. And good people cannot be harmed. So he has this kind of a moral invulnerability, which makes it irrelevant, makes the whole topic of forgiveness irrelevant for someone like Socrates, because you can never, if you're a virtuous person, you can never actually be harmed, and therefore there's nothing to forgive anybody for, and he actually doesn't forgive his persecutors. So that's just a kind of a footnote which helps to illuminate the conditions under which this entire topic arises, which is that actually you can harm a good person, and anger is therefore appropriate kind of response. So you have to kind of adopt that view of human vulnerability in order to make topics like forgiveness and apology relevant. But secondly, it's true, as you noted, that in my sort of opening remarks, I took the scenario of the innocent victim and the offender, but there's nothing conceptually that prevents overlapping it, such that the victim is both victim and offender. What I would maintain is that my analysis applies in that case also. It applies to oneself as offender, even if one is simultaneously victim. So I would argue that while that, in a sense, complicates it, the same set of criteria that I've set out still hold. Finally, there is a question which was just brought up again about what I think of as the relationship between truth and apology and forgiveness. If you take the case of the Japanese case that Professor Smith mentioned, where you apologize by way of expressing gratitude. So I'm sorry you sort of put yourself out on my birthday, and I hereby apologize for your giving me a present. That apology doesn't meet the criteria of what Professor Smith was calling categorical apology, because categorical apology, as I understand it, entails doing such things as promising not to commit the harm again. And I don't know what that would be in this case, except perhaps not to have another birthday, in which case I guess you'd have to kill yourself before your next birthday, or make sure you have no friends, or something drastic of that sort. So if you universalize that, the result would be absurd, which calls into question whether the idea that this is really apology. And I think another way to try to get at that is to ask oneself whether it's the case that if both parties to the transaction, as in this example, agree to a norm which is actually false, say a norm of what wrongdoing is and what's going to count as apology or forgiveness, whether that still is in fact apology or forgiveness. So vary the example slightly and think of a case in medieval somewhere where there's a code of honor, and someone violates this code of honor and thinks that he's done wrong, and the person who he has wronged also thinks it's wrong. They both completely agree that a wrong has been done, and forgiveness and apology are now due. The offender apologizes, and the apology is accepted, and they'll say, well, everything, we're now reconciled. Was that really apology and forgiveness? Both parties agreed to it. And I would have to maintain here that it isn't. They're confused, just as in the case of expressing gratitude through apologizing. There's something conceptually confused about it, even if both parties actually do agree. And I think this chimes with what was just said about the person who apologizes for when he or she is actually innocent. So to make that slightly more credible, you can take an analogy of a case where two people agree that an injustice has been done or has not been done, and picture an extreme case of a slave and a master where the slave has been somehow brainwashed into thinking that actually he or she should be a slave. you wouldn't accept under those conditions the notion that everything is just and everything is fine, and I would argue that the same thing is true with forgiveness.
If I can respond to both Charles's example and the question, I give an example in the book of, if you imagine a racist community, and you have two racists, and one racist realizes that she isn't racist enough today, right? So she does something that's not racist, and she feels like, I need to apologize to my peers for not being racist enough, right? So I've been too humane and something like that. On my account, you could actually offer a categorical apology for not being racist enough, right? The nature of the norms in play, as long as they are agreed on by the community, makes a categorical apology possible. So I actually think that you can have rather thick meaning, or you could, right, you imagine any number of contextual situations where a community shares a norm that may seem either peculiar or strange or ritualistic or right, just contextually different. I think that doesn't change the the framework for the types of meanings that are exchanged. We may disagree with the core values that are at stake as outsiders, but I think it doesn't affect sort of the, you know, the ritual of the apology. On the issue of the blurring of the boundaries between victims and offenders, in one way, I think my work is all about maintaining those boundaries between victim and offender at one level, because I think so much of our moral discourse, so much of our sense of what deserves blame and what deserves praise is built on these moral traditions that require us to think of sort of clear lines of moral causation. And yes, those are all sort of, in my view, and the way I've trained as a philosopher, those are all largely artifacts of human intellectual organization. And when we've made a world that we attribute blame and we attribute praise, and capitalism is a certain kind of world where we have certain ways of attributing praise and blame, if we were to dissolve those boundaries for how we trace moral causation, none of our moral world would make any sense anymore. In some way, I'm not particularly sympathetic to liberalism as a theory of moral philosophy, but I don't think apologies make any sense unless you stipulate that individual moral causation is the foundation of moral systems, right? That individuals deserve credit and blame. And I'm particularly cautious about maintaining those boundaries between victim and offender. I mean, this is not to say that I don't think there are many cases where there's an individual who is harmed, there is a wrongdoer, the individual who is harmed sort of counter-harms. This often happens where someone does something wrong and then you respond with something that isn't sort of, you commit a moral offense after you've been offended, like war, right? That there is a kind of, right, a back and forth, and there is a messy tangle of offense, counter-offense. But I want to be careful to peel out each offense, identify it as such, such that we can attribute blame and wrongdoing. I think this is especially important in cases of collective violence. In particularly cases where I'm concerned about this is in cases of, say, corporate violence, corporate wrongdoing. When we are very quick to dissolve those boundaries between individual wrongdoers, victims, etc., where it all becomes this sort of conceptual cluster of the corporation, right? An abstraction, right? Enron, as sort of an abstraction, did not do anything wrong, right? Enron did nothing, right? It was sort of the individuals who deserve moral blame within that institution. Also the individuals who created the rules by which Enron operated, right? So yes, there is a sort of a body and a structure of Enron that is more than the individuals, but in the end, individuals made those policies. Individuals make legislation. Individuals make the United States. And a lot of times what I find in cases of collective apologies is that individual wrongdoers, people who have done grievously horrible things, use that strategy of blurring those boundaries to immunize themselves from personal blame. And this is an example I've talked with colleagues recently in the case of Bill Clinton apologizing for Rwandan genocide. Right? We know now that Bill Clinton made a carefully calibrated decision not to intervene based on his recent experiences in Mogadishu and elsewhere. Yet he goes to apologize and say, he doesn't say, I, Bill Clinton, committed a moral failure. He says, we, the international community, failed to name it genocide. And what he's doing there is blurring those boundaries of individual personal responsibility. I'm usually the last person to talk about personal responsibility given my political disposition. But in most cases of moral discourse, when we're talking about apologies and forgiveness, I don't think it makes much sense to even have those conversations if we I think those boundaries are necessary when we talk about moral causation at a root. And if anything, we need a more careful moral accounting of those.
I want to ask to what extent, sort of in a large way, this entire notion is sort of dependent on how we see some kind of notion of personhood or individuality. I see sort of related problems of things like vicarious forgiveness, where you have the problem of the successors to a genocide asking somebody for forgiveness when the actual victim is gone, or for a dead child, or things where personhood changes over time. Sort of Professor Griswold brought up the Strassonian question, so you take Parfit or somebody else who talks about the fact that we're not the same people over time. So maybe if we're only 60% of what we were, we should get 60% forgiveness, and we should only ask for 60% forgiveness. Or the personhood problem of whether you want to harm an authoritarian personality, like throw a shoe at President Bush, where he gets very offended and we might want to penalize this person, but if you shoot the Pope on his waist slumping down, he forgives the person who shot him. So what I want to know is to what extent is really all of this just a long discussion on forgiveness about how we see, how we define individual psyches, individual personhood, individual people. And that discussion is so complicated, we almost never get to the next step because that's so inherently convoluted and controversial.
Well, for my own part, I would say that the topics are intimately tied. So issues of forgiveness and apology are very much dependent on conceptions of moral personhood. And that's part of what I meant about the reliance of notions of forgiveness on moral ideals. So if you didn't have these ideals of moral responsibility, a kind of moral individuality, accountability, notions of the importance of self-governance, if you didn't have those, then I don't think things like forgiveness would be a virtue. Now, that's not quite the same thing as the metaphysical problem of personal identity, these Parfitian problems that you referred to, and the relationship between moral responsibility and the metaphysical question of the persistence of the ego through time is not direct. They're connected, I think, but they're, as we know from Locke, they're not the same thing. But putting that aside, yes, you're right that those are also in the background, and I think you see those, there's all this talk about being reborn through forgiveness and, the transformation of self. But of course, if it's a complete transformation of self, then you wouldn't identify yourself now with yourself as wrongdoer before you. So, that was the pre-transformed me. So I don't actually request forgiveness. That this would be more like third-party forgiveness or something, which would be sort of absurd, right? So you do need some continuity of self, metaphysically speaking, to have the moral self. But I think the relationship between the two is very complicated.
Appreciate if you could speak to the concept that in the apology, what the apologizer is doing to a certain extent, depending on how they do it, is open themselves to the vulnerability of consequence for their action. And could you speak to how that plays into where it is that the apology is or is not effective in establishing that link for emotional understanding, Nick, that you talked about, in order to make it feel like it's been categorical?
One, I think, of the more profound features of apologies is this notion that, at one moment we are, especially consider the context of, grievous moral injuries like Hitler's executioners or something coming to apologize to whichever victims. The idea that at one time you are injuring someone because of a sense of superiority, right? That you are able to view others in the world as mere means to your ends, and you can sort of, one of the specific features I think of the Holocaust is the way that it's able to dehumanize the victim, so it actually doesn't feel like a moral offense, right? And this is one of the sort of the most worrisome features when you sort of see the way that the SS officers were trained, right, to understand the victims as subhuman, and the kind of deep training that they had to undergo to realize that every individual person was not. You may have your favorites, that you might feel a moment of, right, a flash of conscience, and you really need to be able to, right, realize that those aren't really humans. To then transform your view of your victims to the extent that when you come to realize, a case like this, you're perhaps the greatest failure in your life. When you feel like you are, you recognize then that you are, in a very fundamental way, not the person you want to be, that you have not honored the core values that orient your life. And that in that moment of recognition that you are a moral failure, that you then go to the person who you've injured, right? In a way, the person who sort of you should be most afraid to go before, right? You're, in a way, sort of your most vulnerable moment. So, in my account, notice, right, it's not like you're going, right, in sort of, the Catholic tradition, you could do a lot of the process of repentance without actually, you could do it in the confessional, right, in the booth, privately, you never have to actually, address the person you've injured. That process where you make yourself vulnerable and in a way transfer a bit of authority, moral authority to the person you've injured, is in a way a kind of a great moral equalizer, an opportunity for moral discourse that it can also be a great display of virtue and character. It's when you know someone who either refuses to apologize, right? You may sort of, recent politicians may come to mind, right? People who simply, had the John Wayne ethic, right? Never apologize, it's a sign of weakness. When you see that attitude, now it sort of looks like a failure in character because you're unable to recognize your faults and correct yourself and grow and undergo moral transformation. When you see people who have the sort of strength of character to recognize their failures and make themselves vulnerable, to me that often bespeaks great leadership, right? Because you can speak to your victims and to your community and it's almost like you use your failure as a teachable moment, right? Like I now recognize that even I, who am a powerful leader, make mistakes, and our community is built around honoring those values, and I failed, and here's what I'm going to do to transform. I think those are potentially redemptive moments that it's in that dialectical process of moral transformation where our values as a community evolve. That answers your question.
So I have a question, but just quickly to follow up on that notion, I practice as a mediator, and here in the state of Ohio, we've adopted a form of the Uniform Mediation Act where mediation communications are privileged. And I think that in the mediation context, at least for litigated cases, there's a great opportunity for parties to make that apology and to, I think you said, with the moral authority, passing that baton on to the other side, and to do that in a way in the process of mediation where you can offer a heartfelt and a sincere apology, make yourself vulnerable from a moral standpoint, but without sacrificing some of your legal rights. And I think that that doesn't diminish the apology in any way. I think it's just a practical reality of
No, I think it does. I think it severely diminishes the meaning of the apology in various kinds of ways. One because when those apologies happen behind closed doors, right, they're not subject to public scrutiny, right? And oftentimes, I think in case of mediation, when you have injured parties who aren't particularly well versed in sort of the frameworks of apologies and the possible legal consequences of apologies. And we're often very quick, we want to be apologized to. So for many people, as soon as you hear the word sorry, it's like, oh, I got my apology, I win. Right? when in fact, right, attorneys are becoming increasingly skilled at giving that sense that I'm contrite, I feel bad for you, but I accept no blame, right? And I accept no responsibility. And I'm using that, I think potentially this often happens, I'm using that mediation to manipulate you and to, right, gain a foothold. And I think there can be cases where, I think it's wonderful that, in some cases where apologies are privileged, but I think in most cases it turns out to be for the advantage of the more wealthy and powerful party.
Well, and I would assert that that's a misuse of the process and would be an abuse of the privilege that, at least in Ohio, the Uniform Mediation Act affords. It's actually related to the question I was going to ask, so Professor Smith, you talked about apology, and you talked about it from just the standpoint of the person making the apology. Whereas Professor Griswold, you talked about forgiveness, and you talked about there are things, at least from your standpoint, that both the victim and the offender must do in order to complete this process of forgiveness. And I wonder, the two professors, what your thoughts are on that, and Professor Smith in particular, if you think there is something that needs to be done by the other side sort of to accept the apology, or if it's just in the act of making the sincere, heartfelt apology. Thanks.
Yes. I do think that that's the case, and that's partly why I want to emphasize the bilateral character of this process, at least with respect to forgiveness. And I should think this would apply even to apology in a political context. But one of the reasons I had as my, sixth criterion here for the victim is to, address the offender and express forgiveness. And I think that would also hold with respect to accepting the apology, which would be the analogy in the case of apology. If that's not done, you haven't quite done everything you would like to see done. Imagine yourself as the victim who's discharged all of the obligations you can possibly think of, and hasn't actually been forgiven, or the apology has not been received. Somehow the transaction is not complete.
Let me try to answer that question. Let me try to not answer that question in an interesting way. When I hear other sort of people describe what forgiveness is, I tend to think that forgiveness has a structure like apologies, and that there are many different flavors, many different varieties. I think Charles's variety is compelling. I think there are other varieties that have meaning in all sorts of different ways, and I'm not as sort of unified in my notion of what forgiveness is. Given that you have these terribly complex plural notions of apology, what I imagine are terribly complex notions of forgiveness, how a certain kind of apology brings about a certain kind of forgiveness, you can now see just how complicated that terrain would be. So if I give a categorical apology, does that necessarily mean that I must give categorical forgiveness of some kind? I don't know the answer to that question, in part because I'm glad that Charles raised the notion of the unforgivable, in part because I think that is a damaging notion. I think the way that notion of unforgivable is often used is that people describe something as unforgivable and then stop working towards reconciliation. You know what I mean? It's like they name something as so terrible that I'm done with that. And I think that's a sort of a metaphysical absolute that has roots in various kinds of religious traditions, that comes to be politically very dangerous and stalls potential for reconciliation of various kinds. Because if forgiveness has many flavors, which I'm inclined to think, the idea of unforgivableness seems less compelling. It seems like almost a throwing up of the hands.
By the way, I wouldn't maintain, and you didn't ascribe to me, or actually anybody else, the view that if someone apologizes, then the victim necessarily accepts it, any more than if someone fulfills the criteria for forgiveness, the victim necessarily forgives. I don't think there's a logical necessity or even a kind of a moral necessity, but it would be the right thing to do unless the wrong is humanly impossible to forgive at that time. So that's partly what I meant about the interesting deontic status of forgiveness understood as a virtue, which is, again, like in the case of other virtues, under the right conditions, there's a sense in which you should exercise the virtue. You should be grateful. You should forgive. But it's also true that you shouldn't be forced into doing it, because part of its moral value lies in your doing it freely.
If I could say one quick thing that I'm wary of, I'm very wary of cases where people give pretty bad apologies and then expect forgiveness, right? So they utter the words, I'm sorry you felt that way, I'm sorry I came to this, right? That's what they say. And then the person is still sort of lingering and, I don't really feel good about this, not sure what to do. And they say, well, I said I'm sorry, right? I said I'm sorry and I expect forgiveness from you. Why can't you let it go? I think that's quite abusive often in interpersonal and family relationships, where someone gives out, what looks like a pretty bad apology and then demands forgiveness and actually, guilts the injured person into, it's just such a messy, both, in sort of just everyday relations, we don't have very clear conceptions of what apologies are, what forgiveness is, and they can become these moral tools that are used to dominate, right, and to structure the, the family relation in a way that becomes more abusive, right? So I'm wary of those, weaponizing apologies and forgiveness in that way.
Professor Griswold, you talked about bilateral forgiveness, and then Professor Exline talked what I thought was more a sort of a unilateral view of forgiveness, so that forgiveness is unconditional. And I guess I would like to ask you, Professor Griswold, if we believe that forgiveness benefits or may benefit the forgiver more than the forgiven, than the offender, then I guess I'm not sure why require that forgiveness be, in a sense, deserved. Why not simply find that forgiveness has been achieved if the victim has let go of the anger and maybe has developed some positive feelings for the offender, even if the offender does not know that he has been forgiven, maybe could not even care less whether he has been forgiven or not, but the victim actually feels much better and is actually able to move on with his or her life?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So first of all, I would distinguish between unilateral and unconditional, although they are frequently used interchangeably, and I myself succumbed and did it in my book. Because the practice is so wide. But actually in unilateral forgiveness, there's still some conditions. For example, the person you're forgiving must have done something wrong. And if I was correct earlier, then they must in fact really have done something wrong, not just think that they have done something wrong. So, but let's use the terms synonymously. So why is unilateral forgiveness somehow inferior to this bilateral process? I think in part because it's important to distinguish forgiveness from condemnation. And it could be that you could forgive and get over your anger, and in one sense it might be very good for you psychologically. But it might also amount to a kind of condemnation, an enabling of the wrongdoer. Think of the abusive spouse scenario, or there are many other such cases. In that event, forgiveness would no longer be a virtue, a praiseworthy trait, even however good it made you feel psychologically. And I'm assuming that forgiveness is a virtue. So that's one reason, but I would also ask you in return, if you were faced with a case in which the offender were willing and able to apologize, would you not wish for the person to do so? Would that not complete the moral transaction better than saying to yourself, I don't care that you are actually willing and able to apologize. I'm going to do this operation myself, and I feel better as a result. So those are some of the reasons that I would offer in response.
I'd like to follow up on apology in the mediation context. If the victim, whether the apology is contrived or not, or whether it's heartfelt but it's privileged, if the victim is satisfied, if the victim is advised, well, you might be able to achieve more damages than the settlement offer, if you go to trial and the victim says, I'm willing to accept this offer plus this apology, the apology satisfies me, why would you make an external judgment that that's not a good thing or not a good result?
If I can, this example I used yesterday a couple times. In the Ford Firestone rollover class action litigation, remember this? There were, I can't remember how many deaths and serious disfigurements and such. The attorneys for Ford Firestone went to the hospital bed of one of the injured parties, and these were high stakes class action litigation. The attorneys wanted the apology to be, because the victim said, what I really want here is an apology of some kind. They allowed the apology to be videotaped, but no audio. Right? So the public couldn't actually know what the attorney said, right? Which is the first thing I want to hear, right? Did they just go and say, I'm really, really sorry X happened to you, and I feel really bad for you, et cetera, et cetera. No admission of blame. No sense that they're going to change their policies, right? Because we know during this class action litigation, in many cases, and this was the case in Ford Firestone, they were doing the exact same thing still, right? They continued to repeat the offense even while they were apologizing for it as being somehow wrong, right? The idea that they can get away with this, because the victim in this case left that apology, and she was interviewed by the media, and said, those guys seem really genuine, right? No kidding, right? They're trained attorneys who are sort of experienced in the act of sort of the histrionics of contrition. They knew exactly how to say, and that victim who sort of didn't know what to look for gave up in that settlement about $6 million, right? Settled for something like $6 million less. And, at one level, she got what she wanted, but I can't help but feel like she was duped.
But that wasn't my facts. Those were my facts. My facts were a mediation context.
Mm-hmm.
The parties are both there, probably both represented by attorneys and advised about their potential results of the case and the costs and risks of going forward. That was the context that I was speaking about, not the abusive.
Sure. Well, let's say some mediation has something to do with public policy, right? And you have this sort of privileged apology, where the offender makes no commitment to reform or redress, for example. So it's some mediation about something that continues to be publicly damaging, and people are continuing to be injured by this practice while you're in the negotiations, the mediations talking about sympathy. And I think as sort of a public policy matter, those things, I think that there's legislation in various states that have allowed immunity for these types of statements, and I'm not sure how good that is for public policy. I think much of the legislation started because there was one legislator whose child was killed in an auto accident, and the legislator was just really ticked off that no one ever said, just I'm sorry. Right? They just wanted to hear those words, and we can appreciate in many legal contexts, it's just that human element seems so missing. So many people go into legal context not because they want money, but because they want some kind of moral repair. And in some instances, I think immunizing these discussions helps. But I worry about what goes on behind closed doors in terms of public policy, and how again there's such a power differential oftentimes that the parties don't do as well as I'd like to see.
Okay, last question.
Actually, this is, because I get to play the heavy here. Just to follow up to your Ford Firestone example, I know that you spoke about hard to extract, and you certainly wouldn't want to leave the consideration of emotions out of the analysis, but the sound was off, you don't know what was said. What's the objective basis on the basis of which you concluded that $6 million less was not $6 million, that the apology didn't have a material value to that person of $6 million, and that the piece that she, I'm assuming it's a she, could be he, achieved was well worth that to them. And in the context of the relationship between the two parties, this was, in fact, a successful apology and forgiveness.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to say that if any apology is worth $6 million, I want to see it, right? I want to hear it. I want it to be publicly scrutinized in the sense that, I'm working on another book on commodification and law, which is where these, I initially thought that apologies were a good alternative to sort of law and economic movement, right? A way to have conversations about moral meaning in the law aside from economic compensation. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that apologies are commodified, just as commodified as everything else, right? And, if I could see an apology and actually, someone could prove to me that there was $6 million worth of meaning in that apology, I'd be pleased. I'm a little skeptical, though. And I think that's a healthy skepticism, considering sort of the power differential between the parties in that case.
Okay, we could go on, I'm happy to say, but we should probably adjourn for lunch. Please join me in thanking Charles, Nick, and Julie.